Psidron was not your average boy. Oh no, he was far from it. His mind was a marvel, a whirring machine of calculations and facts. By the age of 6, he could recite pi to 100 decimal places. At 7, he had devoured every book in the school library, twice. His parents beamed with pride. Teachers marveled at his intellect. A prodigy, they would exclaim, clapping their hands in delight. Psidron basked in their praise. He preened. He puffed up like a peacock. His ego grew and grew, fed by every compliment, every wide-eyed stare of amazement. But with great intelligence came great arrogance. Psidron looked down his nose at his classmates. He sneered at their simple arithmetic. He scoffed at their fumbling attempts to read. Idiots, he would mutter under his breath. Simpletons. His heart, once filled with the joy of learning, began to harden. It became a cold, calculating thing. Little did Psidron know his brilliant mind would be his undoing. His intelligence, sharp as a knife, would cut him deeply. It would carve a path of destruction through his life. And at the end of that path, well, dear reader, that's where our story truly begins. The classroom was Psidron's kingdom. He ruled it with an iron fist and a razor-sharp tongue. His throne? The front desk, of course. From there he would survey his subjects with disdain. Woe betide any child who dared to answer a question incorrectly. "Wrong!" Psidron would bark, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "How can you be so stupid?" His eyes would narrow behind his thick glasses. His lip would curl in disgust. The other children would shrink in their seats, praying they wouldn't be next. Miss Honey, their teacher, tried to intervene. "Now, Psidron," she would say gently, "everyone learns at their own pace." But Psidron would have none of it. He would roll his eyes dramatically. He would sigh loudly, making sure everyone could hear his exasperation. If they can't keep up, they should go back to kindergarten, he would sneer. Miss Honey's face would fall. She knew she was losing control of her classroom. But what could she do? Psidron's intelligence was undeniable. His test scores were off the charts. How could she punish a child for being too smart? Psidron's bullying was not the typical sort. Oh no, he was far too clever for that. He didn't use his fists. He used his words. His insults were crafted with surgical precision. They cut deep, leaving invisible scars that would last far longer than any bruise. "Oh, Sarah," he would say, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Still struggling with long division. How quaint. Sarah's cheeks would burn. Her eyes would fill with tears. But Psidron wasn't done. Not by a long shot. "Perhaps you should ask your baby brother for help. I hear he's quite good with blocks." The playground was no safe haven. Psidron would stalk between the swings and slides. His eyes would dart left and right, searching for his next victim. "Ah, Tommy," he would call out. "I see you're playing football again. How predictable. I suppose someone has to grow up to pump gas, eh?" But Psidron's favorite target was poor, stuttering Billy. "Billy!" Psidron would mock, his face twisted in a cruel imitation. "Cat got your tongue again?" The other children would laugh nervously. They were relieved it wasn't them in the firing line, this time. It wasn't long before the complaints started rolling in. Parents marched into the principal's office, their faces red with anger. "Something must be done," they demanded. "Our children are being terrorized." The principal, Mr. Trunchbull, would nod sympathetically. He would promise to look into it. But when Psidron was called to the office, he was the picture of innocence. His eyes would widen behind his glasses. His lower lip would tremble. "I'm just trying to help them learn," he would say, his voice small and pitiful. "I don't understand why they're so upset." Mr. Trunchbull would sigh and rub his temples. He knew Psidron was lying, but what could he do? The boy's test scores were bringing prestige to the school. His academic achievements were plastered all over the local newspapers. How could he punish their star pupil? The teachers were at their wits' end. They huddled in the staff room, whispering frantically. "He's out of control," Miss Honey would say, her eyes wide with worry. "He's tearing the class apart." But no one had a solution. No one knew how to handle a child who was smarter than they were. Section 5. Psidron's reign of terror intensifies. As the weeks passed, Psidron's behavior grew worse. His insults became sharper, more vicious. He no longer bothered to hide his disdain. He wore it like a badge of honor. "I'm surrounded by morons," he would announce to anyone who would listen. And oh, how he made sure they listened. In math class, he would finish his work in minutes. Then he would strut around the room, peering over shoulders. "Oh dear," he would tut, shaking his head. "That's not right at all. Are you sure you're in the right grade?" The other children would hunch over their desks, trying to hide their work. During reading time, Psidron would interrupt constantly. "Actually," he would say, his voice loud and clear, "the author's use of metaphor here is quite pedestrian. I could have written it better myself." Miss Honey would grit her teeth. She would count to 10 in her head, but it never helped. Even the school assemblies weren't safe. When the principal asked for volunteers to solve a difficult equation, Psidron's hand would shoot up. He would strut to the front, grab the chalk, and solve it in seconds. Then he would turn to the crowd, bow dramatically, and say, "And that, my simple friends, is how it's done." Section 6. The cracks begin to show. But beneath Psidron's smug exterior, cracks were beginning to form. His classmates avoided him like the plague. They would cross to the other side of the hallway when they saw him coming. They would fall silent when he entered a room. Psidron was alone, completely and utterly alone. At first, he told himself he didn't care. "I don't need friends," he would mutter as he ate lunch by himself. "They're all too stupid to understand me anyway." But deep down in a part of his heart he tried to ignore, he felt a twinge of something. Was it loneliness? Regret? He pushed the feeling away. His parents began to notice changes at home. Psidron became more withdrawn, more irritable. He would snap at the slightest provocation. "You wouldn't understand," he would snarl when they tried to talk to him. "None of you understand." He would slam his bedroom door, shutting out the world. At night, Psidron would lie awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind, once his greatest asset, had become his prison. It raced with thoughts, calculations, and memories of the day's insults. He couldn't turn it off. He couldn't escape, and slowly, surely, it was driving him mad. Section 7. A Mind Unraveled. The day Psidron finally snapped was like any other. The sun rose, the birds sang, and the children trudged to school with heavy hearts. No one could have predicted the storm that was about to break. No one, that is, except perhaps Psidron himself. It started in math class. Miss Honey was explaining a particularly tricky concept. Psidron, as usual, finished the problem set in record time. He stood up, ready to make his rounds and mock his classmates. But this time, something was different. His hands were shaking, his breath came in short, sharp gasps. "You're all so stupid," he suddenly screamed, his face contorted with rage. "How can you not understand this? It's so simple." The class fell silent. Even Miss Honey was too shocked to speak. Psidron continued his tirade, his voice rising to a fever pitch. "I'm surrounded by idiots, morons. I can't take it anymore." And then, to everyone's horror, Psidron began to laugh. It wasn't a normal laugh. It was high-pitched, maniacal. Tears streamed down his face as he howled with laughter. Miss Honey finally snapped out of her shock. She rushed to the intercom, her voice trembling as she called for help. Section 8. The Fall from Grace. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics arrived, their sirens wailing. They found Psidron curled up in a corner of the classroom, muttering equations under his breath. His eyes were wild, unfocused. He didn't seem to recognize anyone, not even his own parents when they arrived, their faces pale with worry. The school was in an uproar. Children were sent home early. Parents demanded answers. The local news vans arrived, their cameras hungry for the story. "Child genius has breakdown," the headlines would later scream. Psidron's fall from grace was as public as his rise had been. In the hospital, doctors huddled around Psidron's bed. They whispered to each other, using big words that even Psidron in his right mind might have struggled to understand. "Acute stress reaction," they said. "Possible psychotic break." His parents listened, their eyes wide with fear and guilt. Where had they gone wrong? The verdict came down like a hammer blow. Psidron would need to be transferred to a rehabilitation center. a facility equipped to handle his unique needs, the doctor said delicately. What he meant, of course, was a place that could handle a child genius who had lost his mind. Psidron, the boy who had once been the pride of the school, was now officially labeled a psychotic man. Section 9. Lessons learned in rehabilitation. The rehabilitation center was nothing like Psidron had imagined. There were no padded cells, no straitjackets. Instead, there were calm voices, gentle hands, and most importantly, understanding. For the first time in his life, Psidron was not the smartest person in the room, and strangely, he found that comforting. Dr. Matilda, his primary therapist, was a kind woman with twinkling eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Intelligence is a gift, Psidron," she would say, her voice firm but gentle. "But it's not the only gift, nor is it the most important one." At first, Psidron scoffed at her words, but slowly, very slowly, they began to sink in. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Psidron learned to meditate to calm the storm in his mind. He learned to listen, really listen, to others. He discovered that everyone, no matter their IQ, had something valuable to offer. He began to see the world not as a place to conquer, but as a place to explore and learn from. Perhaps the hardest lesson was learning to apologize. Psidron had to face the harm he had caused. He wrote letters to his classmates, to his teachers. "I'm sorry," he wrote, his hand shaking as he formed the unfamiliar words. "I was wrong. Can you ever forgive me?" Some replied, some didn't. But the act of apologizing itself was healing. Section 10. Reflections on Pride and Humility. As Psidron prepared to leave the rehabilitation center, he found himself reflecting on his journey. He looked in the mirror, really looked for the first time in years. The face that stared back at him was older, wiser, and infinitely more humble. He had learned at great cost that intelligence without kindness is a dangerous thing. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall, Dr. Matilda had often quoted. Psidron understood those words now, in a way he never could have before. His pride, his arrogance, had nearly destroyed him. It had cost him his friends, his reputation, and very nearly his sanity. But from the ashes of his fall, a new Psidron had risen. He thought about his classmates, about the pain he had caused them. He vowed to make amends, not just with words, but with actions. He would use his intelligence to help others, to lift them up rather than tear them down. He would strive to be kind, to be understanding, to be humble. As Psidron stepped out of the rehabilitation center, he took a deep breath. The world seemed brighter somehow, full of possibilities. He knew the road ahead would not be easy. Trust, once broken, is hard to rebuild. But he was ready for the challenge. For he had learned the most important lesson of all. True intelligence lies not in knowing all the answers, but in being wise enough to know that you don't.